thanks to the speakers. I want to do a question for both Nathaniel and Stephen, I suppose. Maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how the lockouts have changed the city, and if they've achieved anything of what they wanted to achieve. Has there been a reduction in violence where that's happened? I mean, I know that you've done your work in Newcastle, and I know it's starting to happen in Sydney, but if you could maybe both of you shed some light or some ideas on that.
Sure.
You know a lot more
I'll go
about
first.
lockouts than me, so no, you answer. Yeah.
I think generally, from a broad view, it's a very bad look for a city that aspires to be a global city to have words like curfew and lockout involved in its nightlife. In terms of effectiveness, I think we're seeing what we would expect to see, which is that there has been small drops in antisocial violence, but that's what we would expect from such an inconvenience imposed on people, where their regular patterns have just been sort of truncated, cut short. I suspect, we all know people adapt, cultures adapt. I was trying to get at in my talk the idea that if you focus on the site of consumption rather than the culture of consumption, then it's only ever going to be a short-term situation because the culture adapts around the site. I predict that, and I guess you can hold me to this, but I shouldn't have said that, but I predict that if people want to get to that level of drunkenness, they'll start earlier or they'll drink faster. And so we'll probably see that small dip go back up to what's been common in the last few years.
Steve, do you have anything you want to add?
Only these views that, in my mind, recording the recording of violence and small shifts in violence about something like lockouts is never very convincing to me because the recording of public violence is primitive. It is, you know, there is so much that is not recorded, and there are all sorts of things about work practices among police and private security that impinge on that in ways that people don't understand. The other thing is that you can bring down levels of violence and disorder in something like the nighttime economy if you just stop people socialising. You know, you don't know, you're not sure. A lockout might achieve this, but not because it's a lockout in the way that it's thought of, and actually, you know, it's locking people out of a particular venue, which is a problem venue. But anything you do to reduce socialising will reduce violence, but that's not what we really want to do. We don't want to go down that path. I mean, to expand on that just quickly, I remember doing an interview with a police officer in Newcastle about 16 years ago, and this happened. This interview I did with him about crime in Newcastle happened about 1990. He says, there hasn't been much crime in the last few months here in Newcastle. We had the earthquake. The earthquake is the best thing ever for crime in Newcastle. There's been none. Nobody goes out. The city's half in ruins. There's no socialising. You know, so whatever you do to disrupt people going out is, you know, it's an extreme way of bringing down violence. But we don't want to actually have to do it that way. We have to be more sophisticated about it than that.
Before we move off that topic, I'd just like to add two outcomes of the... Newcastle was the pilot for the lockout, and it was there for 1 year before it came to Sydney. Two things that were observed in Newcastle was that when you have a bunch of drunk people staggering around and then trying to get into a place by 2 a.m, the people who aren't organised enough to make it by 2 are the most drunk. So the most drunk people are all mingling around in the street. And inside it's fine, it's relatively okay. But again, as I tried to highlight in my talk, what happens in a venue is only a tiny part of the story. The second thing that happens is that these kids don't go home at 2 o'clock if they're locked out. They take their parties back into the suburbs to completely unregulated private space where you're just as likely to have resident noise conflicts. So they're the two things that I observed in my PhD research.
Tim, your
Yeah,
question?
will your study identify the sources where the people come from that are either creating the problems or enjoying the facilities or whatever? I think to me if that's not done, you're missing something. For example, I was curious, who Who are the people that enjoy, say, the Orient Hotel and so on? Where do they come from? There aren't that many people living in that area.
They're backpackers. The short answer is that. Yeah, that notion of where do people come from, I think that's important. There is this sense of argument going around, usually voiced by residents, action groups or local councils, that people who are involved in vandalism don't have a sense of civic ownership over the space and thus are more likely to come from places outside, but that's very difficult to verify. And it's a very convenient argument for those people. So, as to the merits of that, you know.
The evening's talks was titled "The City After Dark," and when I kind of add up all the tone of the three presentations, it seems to be a fairly dysfunctional city and quite a depressing kind of picture that we painted. Was that a particular entry point into the research, or is that something that evolved in terms of the research, or given there's multiple sort of directions you could have taken, is that something that you kind of were charged with in terms of conceiving the research in the first place, or is it something that has come out? And I guess it's kind of a perspective, obviously, you're presenting that I guess a few people would not like to hear in the way that Sydney gets presented on the global stage. So you're presenting another picture that I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily be comfortable with. So
I can plead guilty to that in some way, I suppose. And this is why I was to speak first, because I'm the bleak one. I was going to talk about danger and the unpleasantness and the violence, and then things would lift up and you'd feel more elevated after I'd stopped. Perhaps, I mean, I'm speaking for myself. One of my key areas of research is homicides, and it's a bleak view about Sydney that I probably have from that. In fact, some of my friends find it extraordinary that if I'm not careful, I can start to morph into my daytime self, and they can take me around places, go to restaurants with me at night time, and I start pointing to places where murders have happened and describe them to people. And I'm actually not good company when I do that for too long. But I feel like I could do a tour group of horrific homicides on different street corners and alleyways through the city. So I plead guilty. Perhaps that came from me. But the others should have been more uplifting.
Well, if I could respond, I was hoping that I might have been more uplifting in that. I think that the rave cultures and the youth subcultures of skateboarding and the dance parties, in a sense, although they move into some difficult areas, they're relatively peaceful areas. They're a kind of expression. There's creativeness and inventiveness there, and the city gets along with these things, and they're re-regulated and they change forms. And I think that's quite necessary, that there should be that freedom of space for these new kinds of cultures to actually emerge and get some sort of expression. But all the while there will be something on the margins, which is violent or illicit drug use or whatever. But I guess the point that I would make is that the violence, although it's the headline material, if we look at the actual numbers of people moving into Sydney on a Friday and Saturday night, for example, and you look at the level of violence, it's not so great in percentage terms.
I might just make a quick point too, just relating to the project. The project is much bigger than violence and death and destruction, and we are also interested in the way in which the arts and culture fit into this picture, and cultural planning in particular is an area of research interest of mine, and also issues around gentrification. Although I don't actually think that's the right term in terms of city centres, but what is it like to live in a city, right in the middle of the city? What are the rhythms and patterns of that kind of lifestyle? And how does that bump up against the nighttime leisure cultures that were talked about tonight? So the bigger study will be more nuanced and perhaps a little less pessimistic. You had a question there.
The presentations have made it clear that reality is complex. Do you think our state and local government decision makers actually understand this?
When we're finished, we can assist in developing that nuance.
I wouldn't be so pessimistic there either, in the sense that if you look back at the history of regulation of leisure in and around the city, I think there have been some very good legislations put in place for the use of public space, for example, and there have been many changes to the liquor laws as various governments of different persuasions try and figure out what's the solution. I mean, perhaps there's never one solution for any one age, and it's a constant matter of keeping to change. And I guess the thing that I find encouraging is that the legal frameworks around leisure don't simply come down and shut it out, and that's one of the few places where we have freedom of expression. And so the legal introductions there, the laws that have been put around leisure are not totally suppressive. I think that's a good thing.
We're in a scenario around regulation that I really can't quite pick the direction of myself at the moment, because we've entered this new period, it seems, where the Hotels Association doesn't have the lobbying power it used to. And it seems to have less influence over public opinion, as a middle class opinion, city council, and new types of lobby groups. But at one and the same time, the fiscal crisis of the state, as it's called, is extreme in New South Wales at the moment. The public coffers are empty. So I don't know how far politicians in New South Wales will go in any direction that regulates venues in such a way that their own budgets are reduced. We live in interesting times.
Time for one last question, I think. If you have a question.
Will your study be pursuing demographic issues in the night economy? Because it occurs to me that most of what we've talked about covers a reasonably narrow age group. So that the likes of me, most of the people here tonight, when I look around, there isn't a lot. For instance, if I go to the theatre, I go to the opera, and I'm too busy to get to eat before I go, there's nowhere in Sydney you can go and have a meal at 10 o'clock. Well, yeah, there's Hernando's out in Elizabeth Bay and across. There's basically nothing for older people to go somewhere quietly.
You're welcome at McDonald's, aren't you? You're welcome at McDonald's.
24 hours.
I'm probably the only person in this room I've never had a McDonald's.
No, I think we do want to try and capture, kind of a broad span of ages and ethnicities and also the people who not only live in the city but where people come from, the people who travel into the city. So we are trying to capture that. I mean, how successful we will be, I don't know, but it is definitely an aim.
What you're talking about touches as well on what I had in mind when I was talking about marginalisation, people who take themselves out of the equation. They actually don't go out and they think, this is beyond me now, this is just too aggressive, I don't feel I belong in these venues. And I want to actually find who those people are, what their reasons are for withdrawing from nighttime living.
A lot of them actually don't withdraw. I've lived around Potts Point, Elizabeth Bay for quite a long time, and it's totally changed. There were places you could go, there were things you could do, but they've changed. And especially lately, the number of pubs and licensed premises there, but they only really cater for people who want to get burst, heavy drinking.
So I think there's significant scope to affect the overall dynamics of the nighttime economy by extending that evening dining period I mentioned. And we don't have to call it evening dining anymore, we just have to acknowledge the types of activities that are dominant there and extending that further into the night so you can get a meal at midnight and squishing those problematic ones. That's probably inviting more diverse people out into the street through venue availability is probably one of the ways that we can mitigate that dominance of that alcohol soaked thing.
Okay, we need to wrap up there. So I'd just like to thank our speakers, Rob Lynch, Stephen Tomsen, Nathaniel Bavinton, and Philip Watts for his images. And I think that there's some nighttime leisure drinking going on in the next room, so we invite you all to partake. Thank you.